Hello, my name is Simina Pitur, and I will be presenting some preliminary results of our study on poetry-elicited emotions and argue for the importance of this line of research for theatre practitioners. Although the emotional power of poetry has been well documented by writers and readers alike, poetry-elicited emotions have only recently come into the focus of empirical aesthetics. Experimental studies have shown that people do feel emotions in response to poetic language and not just perceive emotions expressed by the text, and that formal patterns such as meter or rhyme can increase their intensity. However, research has almost exclusively chosen to address text characteristics over reader characteristics. Thus, we know little about how and why individuals respond differently to poetry and which individual characteristics best predict these emotional responses. We also know little about what kind of emotions poetry elicits and how different they might be from everyday emotions, as studies have until now either measured a narrow range of discrete emotions in response to a set of poems, or a wide range of emotions but in response to a single poem. Our present study aimed to clarify these issues while also exploring possible underlying mechanisms of poetry-elicited emotions. The study was split into two equal-length sessions. The first focused on measuring reading habits and dispositional traits, while the second focused on measuring emotional responses immediately after reading poetry. We asked participants to read poems of their choice for half an hour, from any source or from a collection we had previously compiled. 437 participants aged between 12 and 83 completed both parts of our studies. We measured reading experience by asking them what they remember to be the longest period of time reading poetry voluntarily, the age at which they had started reading poetry, and how often they had read poetry over the last 6 months. We also measured trait empathy, visual imagery, movement imagery, auditory imagery vividness and control, and proneness to fantasizing. After reading the poems, we asked participants to rate how intense they remember to have felt a set of 21 emotions. Aesthetic, such as awe, epistemic, such as interest, pleasing, such as joy, and negative, such as sadness. We then asked them several questions that assessed to what extent they had empathized with the authors or characters in the poems, the vividness of their visual and movement imagery during reading, and also how clearly they had heard both the words they were reading and other sounds suggested by the poems. Our first aim was to find links between individual differences and poetry-elicited emotions, and we expected reading experience to predict emotion intensity. We also investigated whether the traits we measured predicted emotion intensity and moderated the relation between reading experience and emotion intensity. Our second aim was to tease out underlying mechanisms and hypothesize that poetry-related empathy and imagery would mediate the relation between reading experience and emotion intensity. Our third and final aim was to explore patterns in the recorded emotional responses. A hierarchical multiple regression reveals several predictors. The model explained a total of 39% of variation in emotion intensity, and out of the three measures of reading experience, only the longest period of time was a significant predictor. Out of all 5 traits we had measured, only auditory imagery control and proneness to fantasizing were significant predictors. Moderation analysis did not reveal any significant interaction effects for any of the traits. Our mediation analysis, however, did reveal poetry-related imagery, empathy, and auditory imagery for words but not for sounds to mediate the relation between reading experience and emotion intensity. Furthermore, for participants with higher trait auditory imagery, the link between reading experience and imagery for words was stronger. Finally, we ran a hierarchical cluster analysis to investigate patterns in emotional responses. Results showed that aesthetic emotions tended to be more often elicited together with a couple of epistemic and pleasing emotions, as you can see on the slide. These emotions were also, on average, more intense than the rest. So in some participants with greater reading experience, better auditory imagery control, and a stronger inclination to fantasize, had more intense emotions while reading poetry. Several mechanisms were identified: empathy, visual imagery, and auditory imagery for words. And last but not least, a group of aesthetic, pleasing, and epistemic emotions more often appeared together and on average were more intense than the others. These findings, we think, pave the way to more specific research questions. As the end goal would be to see how text characteristics interact with individual characteristics, we plan to run genre analysis in the future and see whether emotions elicited by some types of poetry rather than others are linked with some individual differences rather than others, and whether they are engaged by some mechanisms rather than others. Powerful language has been historically crucial to the performative arts, and we argue that studying how poetry, a kind of powerful language, elicits emotions could be useful for theater practitioners in two ways. First, considering the audience's characteristics might be useful in anticipating their reaction to the words spoken on the stage. For instance, audiences that are more homogeneous in respect to some traits, such as proneness to fantasizing, or in the reading experience, could have a more powerful response to the dramatic text per se, independent from its delivery. Second, for productions that start with and build upon dramatic texts, it would be useful both to consider how the directors' and actors' individual characteristics shape their emotional responses during the read-throughs, and how they might best take advantage of the underlying mechanisms such as empathy or imagery in reliably recreating the same responses in the audience. Our study has shown that empathizing with the author or characters, vividly imagining scenes from the text, and clearly hearing the words as they are read are mechanisms in eliciting emotions. So perhaps staging is a way of externalizing the first impressions actors and directors have upon reading the text, thus helping the audience to take full advantage of these mechanisms by making them empathize more strongly, watch imagery more powerful than what they would have seen in their mind's eye, and hear the words spoken more convincingly than they would have heard them while reading. And that would be all. Thank you.